What if the person you have been performing for your entire life does not actually exist? Not in the way you have imagined, not with the attention you have assumed, not with the memory you have feared. What if the audience that determines what you wear each morning, what you say in conversations, what you suppress when you want to speak, what you pursue as a career, what you abandon as a dream? What if that audience has always been a projection of your own mind, a phantom crowd that only you can see? And if that crowd suddenly vanished, if their judgment dissolved into mist, if their approval no longer echoed in your thoughts, who would be left standing in the silence that followed? Would you recognize the person staring back from the mirror? Or would you meet a stranger who has been kept waiting your entire life for an introduction that never came? There is a quiet terror hidden inside this question. Because for most of us, the fear of being forgotten by others is only surpassed by a deeper fear we rarely name out loud. The fear of meeting ourselves without a prepared script. The fear of discovering that beneath the carefully constructed performance, there may be nothing we recognize as our own. The fear that the self we have been protecting, curating, and editing for public consumption might actually be the only self we know. And if that self is exposed as a role rather than a reality, we may be left with nothing to hold on to. This is not a video about ignoring what people think. It is not a motivational lecture on being yourself delivered with empty platitudes and generic encouragement. This is an exploration of something far more unsettling. A psychological unmasking that reaches into the deepest chambers of identity. A journey into the space where your social identity ends and something else begins. Something that has been watching you perform from the very beginning of your existence, waiting patiently in the darkness of your own awareness, hoping you would eventually have the courage to turn around and finally see what has always been there. Part 1. The invisible architecture of approval. Every human being lives within a structure they did not consciously build. It is not made of brick, or steel, or concrete. It is made of something far more subtle and far more powerful. It is made of glances that last a moment too long, of silences that arrive a second too late, of laughter that sounds just slightly forced, of the way a room shifts when someone speaks a truth no one asked to hear, of the temperature change when you say something that violates an unspoken rule. You learned this structure before you had words to describe it. Before you could name what was happening, you were already inside it. As a child, you observed with the intense focus that children bring to the task of survival. You noticed which expressions made your parents soften their posture, which questions made the room grow still and uncomfortable, which parts of yourself seemed to dim the light in someone else's eyes when they looked at you. And without ever being told explicitly, without any formal instruction, you began to edit. Not because you were weak, not because you lacked integrity, because you were human, because human beings are born into a world that requires adaptation as the price of continued existence. The infant who cannot signal distress through crying perishes in silence. The child who cannot read the emotional temperature of the family becomes disoriented and lost. The teenager who cannot decode the hidden rules of the peer group stands alone, while others find connection. This is not pathology. This is not a character flaw. This is the original architecture of social survival, etched into your nervous system over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. But here is what psychology understands that most of us never stop to examine. The survival mechanism that was designed to protect you eventually becomes a prison you forget you ever entered. The scanning of faces that kept you safe as a child becomes the hypervigilance that keeps you small as an adult. The careful selection of words that prevented conflict becomes the silence that prevents authenticity from ever emerging. The performance that began as protection ends as identity, and you no longer know where the actor ends and the person begins. You are not afraid of judgment in the way you have always believed. You are afraid of something far more primal, something buried so deep in your evolutionary history that it operates beneath the level of conscious thought. You are afraid of the sensation of falling outside the circle. Because deep in the ancient architecture of your nervous system, in the parts of your brain that have not changed significantly in 300,000 years, being outside the circle meant death. The tribe did not just provide warmth and food and protection from predators. The tribe provided meaning itself. To be cast out was to become invisible. And invisibility, in the ancestral mind, was annihilation. This is why criticism stings long after it has lost any logical relevance. This is why a single dismissive comment from a stranger can echo in your mind for days after the stranger has forgotten you exist. This is why you rehearse conversations that will never happen and replay moments no one else remembers with painful vividness. You are not merely sensitive. You are not merely insecure. You are carrying a survival instinct that is 300,000 years old inside your modern skull. And that instinct does not distinguish between being rejected by a hunting party on the savannah and being disliked by a stranger on social media. To your nervous system, exclusion is exclusion. And exclusion still feels like the edge of extinction. But here's the psychological revelation that changes everything once you truly understand it. The tribe you fear losing may not exist in the way you have always believed. The eyes you feel watching may belong to no one at all. The judgment you anticipate may be a ghost you have been feeding with your attention for decades. A phantom you created and then forgot you created. A projection of your own self-scrutiny cast outward onto empty seats. Part 2. The phantom gaze. There is a concept in analytical psychology that Carl Jung developed over decades of clinical observation. He called it the persona. It is the mask we wear when we step into the social world, the face we present to others, the role we adopt in the theater of human interaction. The persona is not inherently false or pathological. It serves an essential function. It allows us to move through complex social environments without exposing our raw interior to every passing stranger. It permits us to function in professional settings where certain emotions would be inappropriate. It helps us navigate relationships with people who are not ready to see our full complexity. The persona is a necessary adaptation, a social skin that protects what is beneath. But Jung observed something crucial that most people never consider. The persona is a compromise. It is the version of ourselves we present in exchange for acceptance, belonging, and social reward. It is what remains after we have subtracted everything the group finds threatening, strange, or unacceptable. And when we forget that this version is a role, when we begin to believe that the mask is actually the face, when we lose awareness that we are performing, we enter a quiet crisis that unfolds over decades without our conscious recognition. We start living to preserve an image rather than to inhabit a life. We become curators of a public self that may bear little relation to our private experience. We invest energy in maintaining a consistent character, a recognizable brand of personhood, an identity that others can count on and categorize. And gradually, imperceptibly, the performance consumes the performer. The problem is not that you have a persona. Everyone has a persona. The problem is that you have likely forgotten it is a persona. You believe the controlled version of yourself is the real version. You believe the edited thoughts, the filtered emotions, the carefully managed reactions are simply who you are. But beneath that belief, something is always whispering. Something knows the performance is exhausting. Something remembers a time before the mask was glued so tightly to your skin. Consider for a moment the possibility that most of the eyes you feel upon you are not actually there. Consider that the scrutiny you imagine, the constant evaluation, the silent jury you carry in your mind wherever you go. Consider that this jury is composed of faces you have projected onto empty seats. You assume others are watching because you are watching yourself. You assume others are judging because you have never stopped judging yourself. The gaze you fear is a mirror you have turned outward without realizing what you were doing. This is the phantom gaze. It is the internalized observer you created as a child when you first learned that survival required approval. It is the parent who glanced away when you cried. The teacher who favored the quiet students and ignored the ones who asked too many questions. The peer who laughed when you were honest about something vulnerable. You collected these moments like specimens, internalized their meaning, and constructed from them an audience that never leaves. An audience that watches everything you do, ready to condemn, ready to reject, ready to remind you that you are one mistake away from falling outside the circle. But here is what the phantom gaze conceals from those who have never examined it. No one is watching you as closely as you imagine. Not because they are cruel or indifferent, because they are watching themselves. Every person you fear is carrying their own phantom audience. Every person who seems to judge is secretly wondering if they are being judged in return. Every critical glance you receive is someone else's performance, someone else's mask, someone else's desperate attempt to stay inside their own circle. The entire theater of social anxiety is filled with actors, each convinced the spotlight is on them alone, each too preoccupied with their own performance to notice anyone else with genuine attention. You are sitting in a crowded theater where every single person believes they are the only one on stage, and none of them are watching you. They are all watching themselves. There is a strange loneliness in this realization, and also a strange relief, because if the audience is not real, you have been performing for no one. If the jury is a projection, you have been defending yourself against ghosts. If the judgment you fear is actually your own judgment reflected back at you, then the entire structure of your social anxiety rests on a foundation of illusion. And if that is true, then the question becomes unavoidable. Who are you when no one is watching? Not when you imagine no one is watching while secretly hoping someone might be. Not when you tell yourself you don't care while still checking for reactions. When you truly, deeply, actually understand that the watcher was never there. When the phantom gaze finally lifts and you are left alone with yourself. Who remains? Part 3. The shadow revealed. When the phantom gaze begins to dissolve, when you stop pouring energy into managing an external image, something else begins to surface. And it is not always comfortable. It is not always welcome. It is not always the liberation you imagined. For years, perhaps for your entire life, you have been using your attention to manage an external impression. You have been scanning the environment for threats, adjusting your presentation, filtering your expressions, suppressing anything that might trigger rejection. All that energy has been directed outward, toward the imagined audience, toward the phantom gaze. But when that audience fades, when you stop performing, when the social pressure releases, your attention naturally turns inward. And there you discover a landscape you have been avoiding for a very long time. Jung called this the shadow. It is not a mystical concept. It is a precise psychological description of something very real. The shadow is the parts of yourself you rejected in order to be accepted, the emotions you deemed unacceptable and therefore buried, the desires you labeled shameful and therefore denied, the impulses you suppressed so thoroughly that you forgot they ever existed, the qualities you could not integrate into your persona and therefore exiled to the unconscious. The shadow is not evil. It is not monstrous. It is simply the collection of everything you were taught to hide, everything that did not fit the image of who you were supposed to become, everything that threatened your belonging and therefore had to go underground. A man who has built his entire identity around strength and self-reliance may discover, in the quiet, a deep well of fear he never allowed himself to feel, a fear that has been driving him for decades without his conscious awareness. A fear that expresses itself as control, as rigidity, as the inability to trust anyone else, because trusting would mean admitting he cannot do everything alone. A woman praised her entire life for her patience, her gentleness, her capacity to absorb the emotions of others without complaint. May find, when the performance finally stops, a rage she has been swallowing for decades. A rage so old she cannot remember when it first appeared. A rage that has nowhere to go because she never learned how to express it without destroying the image of the good woman she worked so hard to become. Someone who has always played the role of the good person, the ethical one, the one who would never hurt anyone, may encounter ambitions they once condemned in others, desires for power, for recognition, for dominance, that they labeled as selfish and therefore exiled. But the desires did not disappear. They simply went underground, where they fester and distort and eventually emerge in ways the conscious mind cannot control. These discoveries are not pleasant. They are disorienting. They challenge the story you have told yourself about who you are. They threaten the identity you have maintained for so long. They force you to confront the possibility that you are not who you thought you were. But here is the psychological truth that transforms this encounter from a crisis into an opportunity. The shadow is not your enemy. It is your exiled self. It is the energy you cut away to fit into the shape others required. It is the vitality you sacrificed on the altar of acceptance. And when you stop performing, when you stop managing the external impression, that energy does not disappear. It waits. It accumulates. It presses against the walls of your awareness, demanding attention, demanding recognition, demanding to be let back into the wholeness you abandoned. There is a story of a woman named Elena who spent 20 years as the designated caretaker of her family. She was the one who soothed conflicts before they erupted, the one who anticipated needs before they were expressed, the one who absorbed emotions that others could not handle. Everyone who knew her described Elena as selfless, as giving, as the kind of person who would do anything for anyone. And Elena believed this description. She wore it like a badge of honor. She defined herself by it, until the day her youngest child left for college, and the house fell silent for the first time in 2 decades. In that silence, Elena did not feel peace. She did not feel the relief she had expected. She felt emptiness, a hollow space where something should have been. And beneath the emptiness, something else began to stir. A question she had never allowed herself to ask in all those years of service. What do I want? When she tried to answer, she found nothing. She had spent so long attending to the desires of others, anticipating their needs, fulfilling their expectations, that her own desires had atrophied from disuse. She did not know what she wanted, because she had never been permitted to want. The selfless identity was not her nature. It was her adaptation. It was the persona she had constructed to earn love, to secure belonging, to avoid the rejection that might come if she ever admitted she had needs of her own. And when the adaptation was no longer required, when there was no one left to serve, Elena discovered she had never built a self beneath the service. There was no one home behind the mask. This is the risk of living too long for the phantom gaze. This is the danger of performing without awareness that you are performing. You become so skilled at being what others need that you forget you exist at all. The mask adheres to the skin. The role consumes the actor. And when the audience finally leaves, when the phantom gaze finally lifts, you find an empty stage and no memory of the lines that were ever yours alone. But this emptiness, this confrontation with the shadow, this disorienting discovery that you may not know who you are, this is also the beginning of something. Because when you stop performing, you stop dividing yourself into acceptable and unacceptable halves. You stop waging war against your own interior. You begin to see that the parts you rejected were not monsters waiting to destroy you. They were messengers carrying vital information about who you actually are beneath the mask. and the messengers have been waiting a very long time to speak. Part 4. The reconciliation of opposites. There is a silent war being fought inside most human beings, and they do not even know they are the battlefield. One part of you wants security, stability, predictability. The other craves freedom, novelty, the excitement of the unknown. One part longs for intimacy, connection, the merging of self with another. The other fears being consumed, losing autonomy, disappearing into someone else's needs. One part wants to achieve, to prove, to conquer, to leave a mark on the world. The other wants to rest, to simply be, to stop striving and allow existence to unfold without constant effort. You have been taught your entire life to choose one side, to identify with strength and reject weakness as failure, to embrace ambition and suppress passivity as laziness, to present consistency and hide contradiction as confusion, to be one thing, clearly defined, easily categorized, reliably predictable. But here is what psychology reveals about the structure of the human psyche. The opposites within you are not errors in your design. They are not evidence that something is wrong with you. They are the fundamental architecture of your being. Every quality carries its opposite within it. Every strength contains its shadow. Every conscious value is balanced by an unconscious compensation. This is not dysfunction. This is how the psyche is built. The problem arises when you live under the dominion of the phantom gaze. Because the phantom gaze demands consistency above all else. It demands that you be one thing, clearly defined, easily understood, safely categorized. It cannot hold complexity. It cannot tolerate contradiction. It cannot integrate opposing truths. So you learn to amputate. You cut away the parts that do not fit the approved image. You present a simplified version of yourself, polished and coherent, and you hide the mess beneath. But the mess does not disappear. It accumulates in the shadow. And from the shadow it begins to distort your life in ways you cannot control. The man who denies his vulnerability does not become invulnerable. He becomes rigid, brittle, unable to bend when life requires flexibility. He becomes distant in relationships, unable to connect, because connection requires the very vulnerability he has rejected. He becomes explosive in moments of stress, because the pressure of suppressed emotion eventually finds an outlet. The woman who denies her ambition does not become content. She becomes resentful, watching others achieve while she remains in the background. She becomes passive, waiting for permission she will never receive. She becomes depressed, not because life is meaningless, but because her meaning has been exiled. The person who insists they are fine, who denies their pain, who suppresses their anger, who hides their fear, does not become peaceful. They become exhausted. They become empty. They become a shell that looks like a person, but contains no life. The opposites do not cancel each other. They fight for expression. And when you refuse to integrate them consciously, they express themselves unconsciously, often in ways that sabotage everything you have tried to build, in relationships that fail without explanation, in careers that stall despite effort, in patterns of self-destruction that repeat without your understanding why. There is a concept in Jungian psychology called the transcendent function. It is not complicated, though its implications are profound. The transcendent function is the capacity of the psyche to hold tension between opposites until a third thing emerges. Not a compromise. Not a middle ground where both sides are diluted. A new position that contains both without destroying either. A synthesis that honors the truth of each while transcending their opposition. This is not about becoming balanced in the way self-help books describe. It is not about finding a comfortable midpoint where you are neither too strong nor too weak, neither too ambitious nor too passive. It is about becoming whole. And wholeness includes everything. It includes the light and the dark, It includes the strength and the vulnerability. It includes the independence and the longing for connection. It includes the ambition and the need for rest. Imagine a man named David, who had built his entire adult life around rationality. He was an engineer by training and an engineer by temperament. He solved problems with logic. He made decisions with data. He prided himself on never being emotional, never losing control, never succumbing to the irrational feelings that seemed to confuse everyone around him. But David's relationships suffered. Partner after partner described him as distant, disconnected, incapable of real intimacy. David did not understand. He was doing everything right. He was providing, protecting, planning, solving. Why was that never enough? In therapy, after his third relationship ended in the same confusing way, David began to encounter something he had exiled decades earlier. A deep well of feeling he had labeled as weakness. A need for connection he had dismissed as irrational. A tenderness he had never learned to express because no one had ever taught him it was acceptable. At first, David resisted this encounter. This was not who he was. This was not the identity he had constructed through years of disciplined effort. But the therapist asked a question that shifted something fundamental in his understanding. What if the identity you constructed is not who you are? What if it is who you had to become to survive? David began, slowly and painfully, to integrate what he had rejected. He did not abandon his rationality. He did not stop being logical or analytical. He simply stopped using rationality as a shield against feeling. He allowed himself to experience emotion without immediately judging the emotion as invalid. He admitted when he was scared. He asked for help when he needed it. He let himself need others instead of pretending he was completely self-sufficient. What David discovered surprised him. His rationality became more effective when it was not defending against emotion. His decisions improved when he included feeling in the calculation. His relationships deepened because he was no longer performing strength. He was inhabiting humanity. This is the reconciliation of opposites, not the elimination of contradiction, the embrace of it. You are strong and you are vulnerable. These are not mutually exclusive. They are two poles of your existence, and both are real. You are independent and you long for connection. Both are true. You are ambitious and you need rest. Both are valid. When you stop trying to be only one thing, you stop being at war with yourself. When you stop amputating the parts that do not fit the approved image, you become whole. And wholeness is not perfection. Wholeness is the end of self-rejection. It is the peace that comes when you finally stop fighting who you actually are. Part 5. The inward shift of authority. There is a moment in every genuine psychological transformation when something fundamental shifts. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is quiet and almost imperceptible at first. But everything changes after it. For most of your life, the authority for your existence has been located outside you. In the faces of parents you still seek to impress, even though they may no longer be living. In the standards of a society you never consciously chose, but internalized completely. In the imagined judgments of people whose names you do not even know, but whose approval you seek anyway. You have been living with an external locus of evaluation. Your worth has been determined by feedback from the world. Your direction has been set by signals from others. This is not a moral failing. It is not evidence that you are weak or shallow. It is a developmental stage that every human being passes through on the way to maturity. Children require external validation to form a sense of self. Adolescents need the mirror of peers to discover who they are in relation to others. Young adults seek the confirmation of achievement to feel valuable and competent. But at some point, if psychological development continues, the center shifts. The authority moves inward. You stop asking the world who you are and begin answering from within. You stop checking for permission before you act. You stop waiting for validation before you feel worthy. The locus of evaluation transfers from outside to inside. This shift is terrifying to the ego, because the ego was built to manage external feedback. It knows how to perform. It knows how to read a room and adjust accordingly. It knows how to anticipate reactions and modify behavior to maximize acceptance. The ego is a social survival mechanism, and it is extraordinarily skilled at its job. But the ego does not know how to sit in silence and simply be. It does not know how to exist without feedback. It does not know how to maintain its sense of self when no one is watching. When the external authority withdraws, when the phantom gaze fades, when there are no more signals to interpret and respond to, the ego panics. It feels like falling. It feels like dissolution. It feels like death. And in a sense, it is death. The death of the version of you that existed only in the eyes of others. The death of the self that needed constant validation to feel real. The death of the performer who never knew there was a life off stage. There is a story from the desert fathers of early Christianity that illustrates this transformation with profound clarity. A monk named Arsenius lived in the 4th century, and like many of his contemporaries, he sought guidance about how to live a genuine spiritual life. He prayed for direction, and a voice came to him saying 3 things: flee, be silent, pray, always. Arsenius interpreted this instruction literally. He fled from the city, from the crowds, from the demands of social life. He went into the desert, lived in solitude, and became known among the other monks for his profound stillness and silence. He spent decades alone in his cell, praying without ceasing, seeking God in the emptiness. But the deeper meaning of the instruction was not about geography. It was not about physical location. It was about psychology. Flee from the need for recognition. Flee from the addiction to approval. Flee from the phantom gaze that keeps you performing. Be silent enough to hear what is within you, beneath the noise of social expectation. Pray always, which is to say, remain in connection with the center that does not depend on circumstance, the self that exists whether anyone witnesses it or not. This is the inward shift of authority. You stop fleeing toward approval and start fleeing from it. You stop seeking confirmation in the crowd and start finding it in the quiet. You stop asking, "What will they think?" and start asking, "What is true for me?" Not as a declaration of rebellion against society. Not as a performative act of nonconformity that still seeks an audience. As a simple recognition. The center has moved, and you are no longer orbiting the expectations of others. This shift does not make you antisocial or isolated. It does not turn you into a hermit who cannot function in relationships. On the contrary, it makes genuine relationship possible for the first time. Because when you no longer need others to validate your existence, you can finally meet them as they are, without manipulation, without performance, without the desperate hope that they will confirm your worth and fill your emptiness. You can listen without filtering their words through your insecurity. You can love without requiring them to complete you. You can disagree without collapsing into fear of rejection. You can be present without performing. Part 6. The freedom of invisibility. There is a peculiar gift that arrives when you truly understand that no one is watching as closely as you feared. It is not the gift of confidence in the way confidence is usually described. It is not boldness or charisma or the ability to command a room. It is something quieter, something that feels at first like disappointment. You realize that your struggles, your achievements, your embarrassments, your most profound moments of growth and transformation, most of them will never be witnessed by anyone. The world will not applaud when you heal a wound you have carried since childhood. No one will throw a parade when you finally choose yourself after decades of choosing everyone else. The insights you gain in solitude, the courage you summon in darkness, the changes you make when no one is looking, most of them will remain completely invisible. And this realization stings at first. Because the performer in you still wants an audience, still wants proof that the struggle mattered, still wants someone to bear witness and say, yes, I saw what you did. Yes, it was meaningful. Yes, you changed. But then something shifts. You realize that invisibility is not abandonment. It is freedom. When no one is watching, you stop performing. When there is no audience, you stop editing. When the phantom gaze finally lifts, you are left with something you may never have experienced before. The raw, unpolished, uncensored experience of simply being alive without any reference to how it looks from the outside. This is the freedom of invisibility. And it is the foundation of everything genuine. Think for a moment about the moments in your life that mattered most. Not the ones you posted about on social media. Not the ones you announced to friends and family. Not the ones where you received recognition and applause. Think about the moments that actually shaped you, that actually changed something fundamental, that actually remain alive in your memory years later. The conversation that shifted something between you and someone you love, spoken in whispers when no one else was present. The decision you made alone in the dark, when there was no one to advise you and no one to impress. The tears you shed when no one could comfort you. When you had to hold yourself through pain that no one else could see. The laughter that erupted spontaneously, without any awareness of how it looked, without any concern for who might hear. Those moments were not diminished by their privacy. They were deepened by it. They belonged to you completely. No performance, no editing, no phantom gaze dictating how you should feel or what you should express. They were real in a way that performed moments can never be. This is where real life happens. Not on the stage, not in the curated frame, not under the imagined spotlight where every gesture is calculated for effect. In the invisible spaces, where you are simply yourself, without reference to how it appears from outside. In the darkness where no one sees and no one applauds. In the silence where you finally hear your own voice, without the interference of phantom approval or phantom judgment. The more you inhabit these invisible spaces, the more you realize that the stage was always the distraction. The performance was always the escape from something more demanding. The real work, the real growth, the real transformation happens underground, in the dark, where no one can see and no one will ever know. And that is precisely what makes it real. Because it is done for its own sake. Not for an audience, not for approval, not for the phantom gaze. For the simple reason that it needs to be done. A man named Thomas spent years in therapy working through the wounds of a difficult childhood. He explored his patterns, confronted his defenses, integrated his shadow. It was painful, exhausting, invisible work. No one saw him do it. No one applauded his progress. No one knew the battles he fought in the privacy of his own psyche. Years later, someone who had known him before commented on how much he had changed, how much calmer he seemed, how much more present, how much easier to be around. Thomas smiled and said nothing. He did not explain the years of invisible work. He did not demand recognition for his struggle. He simply received the comment and continued being present. The freedom of invisibility had taught him something that recognition never could. The work itself was the reward. The transformation itself was the meaning. Not being seen, not being validated, not being applauded. Just becoming more fully himself, whether anyone noticed or not. Part 7. The Return. When you have spent enough time in the invisible, when you have done enough work in the dark, when you have integrated enough of what was exiled, something interesting happens. You return to the visible world. But you return different. You still interact with others. You still participate in society. You still have roles to play, responsibilities to meet. relationships to maintain. But something fundamental has shifted in your relationship to all of it. You are no longer performing for survival. You are engaging from choice. The phantom gaze no longer dictates your movements. You see it when it arises. The old habit of checking, scanning, adjusting to external signals. But you no longer believe it is real. You know it is a projection. You know the jury is empty. You know the audience was never there. And because you know, you are free. This does not mean you become indifferent to others. It does not mean you stop caring about how your actions affect people. On the contrary, when you no longer need people to validate your existence, you can finally meet them as they actually are. Without defense, without manipulation, without the desperate hope that they will fill your emptiness or confirm your worth. You can listen without filtering their words through your insecurity. You can love without requiring them to complete you. You can disagree without collapsing into fear of rejection. You can be present without performing. You can give without keeping score. You can receive without feeling indebted. This is the paradox at the heart of psychological maturity. The less you need from others, the more you can truly be with them. The less your identity depends on their response, the more authentic your connection becomes. The performer finally rests, and in the resting, something real emerges. There is a woman named Sarah who spent her entire career as what she later called a professional people pleaser. She anticipated needs before they were expressed. She absorbed criticism without defense. She suppressed her own preferences to maintain harmony in every situation. She was exhausted, but she did not know any other way to be. The phantom gaze had governed her since childhood, and she had never questioned its authority. When Sarah began the inward journey, when she started withdrawing energy from the endless performance, she feared she would become selfish. She feared she would lose relationships that mattered to her. She feared she would be rejected by everyone who had come to rely on her constant accommodation. And some relationships did end. Some people who had benefited from her endless giving, who had grown accustomed to her always being available, always agreeable, always putting their needs first, could not tolerate her new boundaries. They accused her of changing, of becoming cold, of no longer caring. And Sarah let them go. Not bitterly, not vengefully, simply with the recognition that relationships requiring self-abandonment are not relationships at all. They are transactions dressed in the language of love. But the relationships that remained transformed. They deepened. They became real in a way they had never been before. Friends who had always received from Sarah began to ask what she needed. Colleagues who had always taken credit began to share recognition. Family members who had always expected service began to offer support. Sarah discovered that the freedom of invisibility did not isolate her. It connected her more deeply than she had ever been connected before. Because she was no longer relating through a mask. She was relating as herself. And herself, it turned out, was someone worth knowing. Someone worth loving. Someone worth being with. Not for what she could provide, but for who she actually was. This is the return. Not to the stage, not to the performance, not to the phantom gaze, to genuine presence with others, made possible by genuine presence with yourself, to relationships built on reality rather than roles, to a life lived from the inside out rather than the outside in. Conclusion. So here you are, at the end of this exploration. And perhaps something in you has shifted during the time we have spent together. Perhaps the phantom gaze feels slightly less solid than it did an hour ago. Perhaps the audience seems a little less real. Perhaps you have glimpsed, for just a moment, the vast empty theater and the strange relief of performing for no one. You will return to the world after this video ends. You will encounter faces and expectations and the old habit of scanning for judgment. The phantom gaze will try to reassert itself. The performer will want to take the stage again. But something has been planted. A question that will not leave you. a memory of what it felt like to drop the performance, even for a moment, a recognition that the self you have been protecting, curating, editing, performing, that self may not need protection. It may need expression, not for an audience, for itself. The greatest privilege of a human life is not to be seen by others. It is not to be famous or admired or remembered. It is to see yourself, not the version you constructed for approval, not the image polished by the phantom gaze, the whole, contradictory, unfinished, evolving self that has been waiting in the dark throughout all the years of performance, watching you perform, hoping you would eventually turn around and notice that you were never alone in that empty theater. You were never alone. The one watching from the darkness, the one who saw every performance, the one who knew the mask was not the face. That was always you, the deepest part of you, the self that existed before the persona was constructed, the self that will remain after every role has been played, the self that has been waiting your entire life for this reunion. You have spent so long trying to be seen by others. Perhaps it is time to finally see yourself.